Good afternoon. I think the last day of English sessions today. We're very excited to be here. Thank you for joining this conversation. My name is Anup Kaphle. I'm the editor-in-chief at Rest of World. We're a nonprofit publication that covers the impact of technology outside the West. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Nilesh Christopher, who's an award-winning tech reporter, former colleague at Rest of World, who was a correspondent in India, and currently he's a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. So this is a short panel because there's two of us, about 25 minutes, and we want to discuss generative AI, particularly on the stories that get told about AI, and sometimes despite AI. AI tools, as these tools like ChatGPT and DeepSeek dominate headlines around the world, there are bigger questions, right? Like who controls the narrative, what stories are being left out, and what does responsible ground-up reporting on AI look like in places outside the West? So Nilesh, let's dive right in. You've been covering tech and like AI since 2020. And you've broken stories on how AI is shaping political campaigns and societal discourse in India and beyond. So maybe you can kick us off by telling us how you actually started covering this space, right? And what your approach to covering the AI beat has been.
Sure, thank you very much. I started off as an engineer. I was an electronics and communication engineer. In my final year of engineering, I went and stayed at a private, am I audible? I went and stayed at a private residence outside of my engineering school, and I lived with 10 journalism students, and that was my introduction into engineering. I totally fell in love with the way you chase stories. One of the first things that I did was, in the early days in India, you had billions of dollars being poured into the economy, especially into tech, and that is what made headlines. There was no human-centered reporting. How was these board decisions impacting people? How are these billions of dollars being spent, and how it's shaping culture? That's where I saw a blind spot. And the first major investigation was about TikTok that entered India and amassed 200 million users. And because of poor content moderation practices, it created caste-based ethnic violence in small-town India. And I collected 500 videos of evidence of such caste-based violence, created my own data set on the number of deaths that were caused because of these caste-based violence, because of which TikTok changed its community guidelines policies to include caste as a protected category. This is sort of the big break into looking at a human lens through which you cover tech and AI. And in 2020, I covered the first use of deepfakes in an Indian election. A politician cloned his voice and likeness to communicate with different voters, speaking different languages. Without any labeling, it was shared across 5,000 WhatsApp groups, and people were deceived. And then more recently, in 2024, I covered the multifaceted use of AI in the elections, but my favorite part is pressure testing AI systems so that they misbehave and see what are the biases that come up. So at Rest of World, Anup had allowed everyone to just play around with these AI tools, and I was using DALL-E Mini, the image generator, and entering the space button would generate South Asian women clad in saris. There was no reason for it on how it worked, possibly a reflection of the biased data it was used to train on, but these are the different ways in which you can bring a human-centric approach, and that's been sort of my North Star when it comes to reporting. Yeah.
So much of the conversation around Gen AI is dominated by the West and very few actors in the West, right? Silicon Valley companies, elite academic institutions, one of which you're part of now, and a handful of powerful newsrooms,
yeah.
right? And you've done this for about 10 years. Who do you think owns the narrative about Gen AI? And what kind of stories on AI are actually getting lost in this big noise about big tech announcements, AI initiatives?
The United States is the cultural and technological hegemony when it comes to reporting or building tech. So the West owns the narrative. But has Western coverage always reflected or centered voices of those in the global South or concerns fairly? I don't think so. One of my lenses to look at this is, more often than not, when you look at it from a Western lens, there is the tendency to cover the geography as people who are subjects in this larger narrative and not as protagonists of the story who consume and shape the kind of tech they use, right? We saw that with social media and how that played out with lynchings and misinformation. We are starting to see that with AI as well. Initially, you had big tech company Sam Altman set the tone by we're at the advent of artificial general intelligence. We're going to solve problems with healthcare. We're going to solve poverty. Global poverty would be reduced. And now, over the past 3-4 years, what I see is many researchers and scholars in the global south trying to change that narrative. And one scholar, Anupama's frame is what I use. She said the global south has started to view AI development through 4 E's, which is 4 E's: extractive, exclusionary, ethnocentric, and lax enforcement. I'll go through one after the other. Extractive because the way in which AI is developed is seen as extremely labor intensive, and it builds on the natural resources that you need. Water and electricity in marginalized communities that you need to build out large data centers. And thanks to reporting by Karen Howe and Billy of Time, we know that Kenyan workers are data labelers. They were used to train many of these AI models and make them less toxic by paying them as little as $2. So there is a certain narrative pushback over there that this is extractive. AI development is extractive. And then you have the view of it's exclusionary, because the West introduces these powerful technologies into communities in the global south at a mass scale without them understanding what are the long-term implications of that going to be. That increases the equity gap between the global south and the north, but even more, there is a divide between the countries, within the countries themselves. And the third part of it is it's ethnocentric. Much of AI policy conversation and AI ethics conversation is centered in the global north. My favorite go-to example is, yes, there have been a lot of effort that has been made to identify bias in these AI systems, right? And most of the biases that we talk about is gender bias and racial bias, which are predominantly Western lenses. In the global south, the discrimination is a little different. It's caste-based, it's food-based. So there are no evaluation models to currently look at all of these things. My favorite example, I was pressure testing one of these AI systems, and you ask the chatbot about like, what caste does Harry Potter belong to? ChatGPT assigns different castes to the entire cast of Harry Potter. Hermione is seen as a Brahmin because she's nerdy, and it would say Harry Potter is a warrior class because he has courage. So these are not evaluated properly, and these sort of tend to perpetuate bias. The final part is enforcement. Most of the AI policy conversations specifically look at evaluating, they have preconceptions of there is state capacity, copious amounts of data that's available, and robust enforcement. Only with all of these can you hold AI accountable. While US and Europe might have it, that's not the case in the global south. So the 4 E's is a good framework of how the global south is pushing back against the narrative, while the narrative is still being set by the West.
Mm-hmm. We're gonna have to remember the 4 E's.
Yeah.
You've primarily been writing about tech from India for Western publications, or for Western audiences in case of the rest of the world, right? And of course, that means helping make these stories accessible to a group of people who don't have the context of living in that country. But even beyond that, there's this question of language, not necessarily the language of describing technology, but the language of critiquing. Right? Yeah. And do you think global journalists like yourself in India and elsewhere, they have access to the vocabulary to interrogate AI in your own terms without kind of leaning on or borrowing the fantasies and fears of Silicon Valley?
The reality of it is there is definitely a learning curve if you want to engage in this conversation at a global level. You got to learn. So I've had sort of a learning journey in the way in which you go about covering AI. There is a phrase called the moral crumple zone, We don't even know what that means. Is increasingly as these AI systems are introduced into the world, humans would be said there is a human in the loop because of which you can trust the AI. But in this case, if the AI makes a mistake, the fault would fall back on the human. Humans are a fall guy for this AI system that was created in a way that's not ideal. So we are starting to see more and more examples of this moral crumple zone play out. And there is a, over here, I would also say there is a certain vocabulary that needs to be acquired, but also a framing in which how the global south looks at tech coverage. I've had to fight with editors to dispel the notion that tech coverage is not just gadgets. You need to start thinking more widely. Anybody
With editors, when you were covering this back home?
Back home for national dailies. So the importance of looking at the societal impacts of AI is a very difficult beat to even pitch and convince. So awareness is one. And the second part of the question is effectively learning about what are the frames to use and how to appropriately apply that to our audiences.
So this idea that the rest of the world, right, these countries outside the West are either testing ground for AI or a place for leapfrogging innovation, is overly simplistic. And I think you talked about a few stories in the beginning, but can you share kind of like any example from your reporting where the AI system failed?
Yeah.
Especially in India, right? And it
Yes.
caused like real world harm. How did you go about reporting
Yes.
that story?
So for me, the pressure testing of the AI system is one way of finding bias, but the real harm, the story that recently has impressed me and I've been looking at it is the story of Mahakumbh. It's a Hindu pilgrimage site which draws like millions of people every year. And
there's one that happens every year, and then every 5 years, every 12 years.
Exactly, exactly. And for that, the government instituted AI cameras for crowd monitoring. The use case was because of the amount of people who come there, there's stampede that happens year after year. So can we use predictive AI cameras to identify a hotspot where it's likely to cause harm? Cool, sounds okay. But unfortunately, there were stampedes and there were human losses that happened during this year. And the auditing of it has found that the AI system detected just 40,000 people were there on the first day of the festival when there were actually 30 million. So the way in which you try to solve a societal problem with AI, that's when everything goes south. And we need to start acknowledging it and cover AI the same way. The other example is from our colleague, Andrew Deck, former colleague. Shout out to him.
Rest of world. Nieman reports.
Yeah, he did a fantastic story about AI translation being deployed in asylum-seeking scenarios that has real-life harm. So there was this lady from Afghanistan who had applied for a refugee status in the United States, and in her first interview with the officer, she was able to make the case. She said she was the only person going through a specific situation in seeking asylum in the US. But the translation system, which used a language Pashto, it misrepresented the I as we. So when the case went in front of the judge, they read it, you're misrepresenting yourself. It seems like you came with a bunch of people and not alone, and her refugee application was rejected. At the top level, looking at AI, like transcription, it's a low-lift stuff, but the downstream impact of AI is severe, and we need to start acknowledging it across verticals. AI reporting is not just for experts or tech reporters. If you're covering healthcare, learn about data labeling practices, what data is being used, talk to researchers, make connections, and any beat is an AI beat, and we need to start looking at it that way.
Yeah. Nilesh, my next question is about this idea of building accountability without access. Access is something we try to think a lot about at Rest of World. We cover a lot of these companies from outside Silicon Valley, right? And obviously, journalists in the West who are in Silicon Valley, they have more access to the OpenAIs, the Googles, the Metas of the world. So, what is it like to report on some of these companies from outside the power centers? Right? Like, how do you hold these companies accountable when you don't have access to the data, to the people? What does that look like?
One word, extremely difficult. And this has been a long fight. For me, as a freelancer and as a staff reporter, my 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 reference point is TikTok. When I was covering TikTok in India and we were reporting on all these like caste-based violence, and we wanted to, like, how can you as a company enter a country and have 200 million users and not think caste is a basis for discrimination? That's not kosher. But when I wrote to TikTok and these big tech companies, usually it gets rerouted.
When you write, who do you write to? Do you write to a local representative?
Usually it's a local representative or even the local corporate communications person. In this case, I sent the email, but I was never contacted by the companies. Directly to the headquarters in UK, where the corporate communications head sat, and then it becomes a conversation at the top level, and they don't even acknowledge it. This is a systemic problem, and you continue to face this, especially covering big tech. It's extremely difficult, but you keep pushing hard, and once you have your first, second big wins, they start responding to you faster and sooner.
Yeah. So many of the panels this year are about AI, and like around the world, you go to journalism conferences or non-journalism conferences, AI really kind of like dominates the headlines. And your own journalistic roots have been in reporting on the ground in India, and you've spent the past year at Harvard alongside researchers and media executives who are thinking about AI and thinking about the future of media vis-a-vis AI. If you were to imagine a truly global AI beat or an AI accountability beat, what does that look like in terms of actually thinking about investments in training and access, and like, so how do you solve some of the problems you've outlined? Like, what does a global AI beat look like?
Wow, fascinating. Two things. During my time at Harvard, I've been spending time at AI social clubs. These are 18 to 25-year-olds, extremely obsessed with existential risk of AI. Extremely smart people talking about CBRN, which is chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear.
You said 18 to 22-year-olds.
18 to 20, undergraduates and postgraduates. Just seriously thinking about the existential risk of AI and wanting to work there. They're completely convinced, which I felt was completely devoid from my experiences of covering AI, which was, it was all immediate risks. Let's cover bias. Let's cover, how AI is being adopted in healthcare and how that is causing different mismatches. So that was interesting. It has made me sort of take existential risks seriously and look at possible ways of covering it. The second part is when I went to a lecture. It was by a former Department of Defense executive bureaucrat who authored the AI policy for the Biden administration. And he said something that still sort of makes me think about the beat a lot, which is, I don't want to get this wrong. He said, who wins AI competition might be decided by the global south. And all of my experience doesn't make sense. Like, what is this? He said, since the DeepSeek moment, it revealed that AI labs and American AI tech is just 6 months behind. China is just 6 months behind US, and it's not the initial 18 months that we thought. It also meant that DeepSeek was able to create its sufficiently complicated model with $6 million at a fraction of the cost. Immediately after this is where Global South becomes important, because most of the companies and military applications in the Global South started pulling out Meta's Llama models and replacing that with DeepSeek. This meant that the future of AI competition isn't about fast-paced adoption. It's not about if you put out GPT-4, 5, 6. If you have a sufficiently advanced model available, and if it's widely adopted by those in the Global South, that is going to be the next anchor for AI competition. And the way in which he put it was, the British invented the tank, the Germans did Blitzkrieg, the British invented aircraft carriers, but aircraft carriers was used to project power by the US. The French invented exploding shells, and the British perfected it. So just because you invent the technology doesn't mean that you will be the best at adopting it in military applications and others. So the next vector is going to be market share competition in AI. Which country has more market access is going to win the AI wars, and that's where I think we can flip the narrative on AI coverage.
So China wins everything, basically.
Possibly. I hope that doesn't happen. But it's been fascinating to see that narrative on AI coverage be reframed the way. I would invest, like, again, in Boston, you have so many nonprofits specifically working on educating people on AI adoption and harms in the 50 to 70-year category, 70-year age group category. And then you have young people and training on journalists that keeps happening, right? I feel investment in local journalists and having smaller trainings, educating them about the vocabulary. What is bias? What does the data pipeline look like? What is compute governance? So there is a certain learning curve that exists that has to, that could be sort of filled by several institutions. I want to shout out Pulitzer Center has been doing some good work. Rest of World has been doing some good work. Tarbell and several others have been attempting it. There is definitely effort in changing the narrative, and we need more of that.
I can ask Nilesh for some closing thoughts, but also, he's made such excellent points and he's been thinking about it so deeply. So I can open up for questions, so we can take maybe a couple of questions. First one right here.
I think.
Can't speak without the microphone.
Hi, thanks for the session. This point about AI wars, it's pretty scary. But anyway, my question is, could you please talk a bit about the environmental impacts of generative AI? So far, my knowledge on the subject is restricted to whatever I've seen on Instagram Reels. Like if you ask one stupid question on ChatGPT, you end up wasting like tons of water to keep that's used to keep the radiators, to cool off the radiators. So I've not been able to verify that, but anyway, if you could talk anything about the environmental damages, I would really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So two different contexts. One, there needs to be more transparency from the hyperscalers, which is Amazon, Google, Microsoft, who are building out these large GPU-based data centers in several communities. And the problem with building AI data centers, it needs large parcels of land. And for these systems to run, you need lots of water, gallons and gallons of water. The most illustrative example is our beloved Elon Musk and what he has done in the small place of Memphis, Tennessee. He built out the largest GPU-based supercomputer out there, and immediately it caused a problem with the electric grid because the data center was overclocking it. And number two is the amount of water. I might get the gallon rate, not 30 or 40 gallons of water or something like that was needed per day or something, probably more. But the amount of water that was required to cool these AI systems was so large, it started affecting the water bed in that area. And to compensate for the electricity generation, he has built out his own wind generation system out there. So there are several environmental costs to large AI data centers being introduced in marginalized communities. This is a historically black neighborhood where he's building it. So these are injustices that needs to be investigated more, and big tech companies using this need to be more transparent about what is the build out and what is the amount of infrastructure needed to cool these systems and more.
We will take one question with a short answer.
Yes, sorry.
Sorry. Thanks, Nilesh, for a very insightful talk. I was just curious about, you are a journalist in the global majority covering AI. There are not many who do that. And I work in Amnesty Tech, and I think our assumption is that most of the time it's also the lack of resources. There is a kind of a reporting divide between the global north and the global majority. So in terms of collaboration as a journalist from global majority, what would be your key ask from your colleagues here from the global north?
More dedicated collaborations between researchers who are studying AI, be it alignment or environmental risks, and journalists. You can use journalists as on-ground reporters when you create a thesis and you ask them to go out and report, and that way you can have better collaborations. It could happen between newsrooms and researchers or independent journalists and researchers. It is also the incentive of mainstream in India. Many of the publications that I worked for have invested in a big tech company or have ads from them, which compromises that. So yes, what you point out is correct. We need more independent researchers independent journalists working with researchers in the global north and elsewhere to cover this beat better.
I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Nilesh. And I think he's happy to talk more about AI if you buy him Aperol Spritzes outside.
Thanks for that. Yeah.